The announcement of Burkina Faso's massive $14 billion grain deal with India has reverberated across the globe, sparking debates, admiration, and in some quarters, outright surprise. At the heart of this development stands Captain Ibrahim Traore, Africa's youngest president, who has once again demonstrated an uncanny ability to redefine expectations, break historical patterns, and chart a path that places Burkina Faso and Africa at the center of global economic conversation. The scale of this deal, the sheer financial weight it carries, and the symbolic message embedded within it has left observers stunned, prompting questions about what it truly means for Burkina Faso, Africa, and indeed the rest of the world. When the details first emerged, analysts initially struggled to grasp the scope. $14 billion earmarked for a grain partnership is not a small matter. It represents one of the largest agricultural trade agreements between Africa and Asia in modern history. To appreciate the magnitude of this, one must first place it in context. Burkina Faso, long considered one of the world's poorer nations, often described in economic reports as struggling with food security, has not historically been associated with billion-dollar grain transactions. Yet under Traoré's leadership, the country is rapidly repositioning itself. This deal is not just about grain, but about power, sovereignty, and the construction of a new global order that challenges long-standing hierarchies of trade. At its core, the agreement signals the rising importance of Africa as not only a consumer of global trade, but as a key supplier. India, a nation of over 1.4 billion people, faces immense pressure to secure consistent food supplies for its vast population. Climate variability, changing monsoon patterns, and domestic agricultural challenges mean that India cannot solely rely on its internal production. For New Delhi, ensuring long-term food security has become a national security priority. Turning to Burkina Faso and committing $14 billion signals confidence in Africa's potential, and, more importantly, confidence in the leaderships of Traoré to deliver. For Burkina Faso, this represents a monumental opportunity. Agriculture has always been the backbone of the Burkinabe economy, with millions of citizens working as farmers. Yet, historically, much of this agricultural potential remained untapped due to poor infrastructure, lack of investment, and systemic exploitation under international trade systems. Traoré's government has sought to break this cycle, repositioning agriculture not as a sector of subsistence, but as a driver of industrial and economic transformation. The Indian deal provides capital, technology transfer, and a guaranteed market, three elements that can fundamentally reshape the nation's trajectory. Observers are calling this deal a masterstroke because it achieves multiple objectives simultaneously. First, it guarantees Burkina Faso a long-term buyer for its grain, ensuring stability in export revenues. Second, it unlocks billions in investment that can be channeled into modernizing the agricultural sector, new irrigation systems, storage, facilities, transport networks, and mechanized farming equipment. Third, it gives Burkina Faso geopolitical leverage, transforming it from a marginal player in global trade to a strategic partner whose cooperation is increasingly valuable. But perhaps most significantly, it signals a new African approach to partnerships. Traditionally, African nations entered into trade agreements that often left them disadvantaged. Raw materials would be exported cheaply, and finished goods imported at inflated prices. Traoré's vision disrupts this colonial model by negotiating on equal terms. In fact, reports suggest that part of the deal with India includes provisions for Burkina Faso to retain a share of processing within its borders. This means more jobs for Burkinabe workers, value addition within the country, and a departure from the historical role of being simply a raw material supplier. The symbolism of this move cannot be overstated. For decades, global grain markets were dominated by the West, North America, Europe, and increasingly, large-scale producers like Russia and Ukraine. With geopolitical instability threatening those supply chains, nations like India are looking for reliable partners elsewhere. By stepping into this gap, Burkina Faso, under Traoré, is not just supplying grain, it is supplying confidence and stability in a world of uncertainty. The message to the West is clear. Africa is no longer a passive bystander in global trade, but a proactive architect of its future. Critics, of course, have voiced concerns. Some argue that the risks are high, that Burkina Faso may not be able to deliver consistently on such a massive contract. Questions about infrastructure, logistics, and even political stability have been raised. However, supporters counter that such deals are precisely what is needed to overcome those very challenges. With $14 billion on the table, the incentives for reform, innovation, and modernization have never been greater. And with India as a partner, Burkina Faso is not walking this path alone. It is also important to analyze the regional ripple effects. If Burkina Faso can successfully execute this grain partnership, it sets a precedent for other African nations. Countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan, also rich in agricultural potential, may follow suit, creating a wave of South-South trade that bypasses traditional Western intermediaries. This could fundamentally reshape global trade flows, with Africa and Asia tightening economic ties at a scale not seen before. For India, diversifying its sources of grain makes strategic sense, but for Africa, it is nothing less than liberation from economic dependency. Domestically, Traoré has presented the deal as a step toward food sovereignty, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa at large. By leveraging agriculture as a tool of empowerment, his leadership is reframing how Africans view their land. Far from being barren or cursed by colonial underdevelopment, it is being repositioned as the foundation of global relevance. The Burkinabe farmer, once seen as laboring in obscurity, is now part of a global supply chain worth billions. That sense of dignity, of being valued on the world stage, carries profound psychological and social weight. Moreover, the deal with India comes at a time when Burkina Faso is redefining its political alliances. Having distanced itself from Western influence, Traoré has pursued a policy of sovereignty and non-alignment, strengthening ties with Russia, China, and regional African partners. By adding India to this list, he broadens Burkina Faso's network of allies, ensuring that no single bloc can exert dominance. This diversification of partnerships reflects a shrewd understanding of geopolitics, where the ability to balance multiple relationships ensures survival and growth. The economic implications are vast. With guaranteed revenues from grain exports, Burkina Faso can channel funds into infrastructure, education, and healthcare. If managed prudently, the $14 billion deal could become the backbone of a broader development agenda. The EU government has already hinted at establishing agro-industrial zones, where grain production will be integrated with food processing plants, packaging industries, and export facilities. This would create jobs, reduce youth unemployment, and generate multiplier effects across the economy. International observers are watching closely. For some, the success of this deal would validate the broader vision of Pan-Africanism, where Africa leverages its resources not as a source of dependency, but as a tool of independence. For others, it raises concerns about shifting global power balances. If Africa and Asia deepen their ties, what role remains for Europe and North America? Already, think tanks in Western capitals are warning that they risk losing influence if they underestimate the speed of Africa's transformation. The narrative surrounding this deal has also touched on history. For centuries, Africa's agricultural wealth was exploited through systems of slavery, colonial extraction, and neo-colonial dependency. To see Burkina Faso now negotiating billion-dollar deals on equal terms is, in many ways, a rewriting of history. It signals that the continent is no longer willing to be defined by external forces, but is writing its own story. At the same time, challenges remain. Implementation is key. Delivering $14 billion worth of grain consistently requires efficient systems, transport infrastructure must be improved, corruption must be minimized, and farmers must be adequately supported. Traore's government will have to strike a careful balance between serving global markets and ensuring domestic food security. The last thing Burkina Faso needs is to export grain at the expense of feeding its own people. This delicate balance will test the resilience and foresight of the administration. Yet, if history has shown anything about Traore, it is his willingness to take bold risks. From expelling foreign military presence to reshaping Burkina Faso's alliances, his leadership has been defined by audacity. This deal with India is an extension of that audacity, a declaration that Burkina Faso is ready to think big, act big, and claim a seat at the global table. As the months progress, the world will watch closely how this agreement unfolds. If successful, it may well mark the beginning of a new era where African nations no longer wait for aid or handouts, but command respect through trade, negotiation, and equal partnership. The $14 billion grain deal with India is more than a contract. It is a symbol of possibility, a statement that Africa can and will shape the 21st century. What shocks the world most about this deal is not just the number, though $14 billion is staggering in itself, but the message it carries. It tells the world that Africa is rising, that its leaders are ready to seize opportunities, and that nations once overlooked are now indispensable. Traore has once again positioned himself not just as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as a voice for a continent striving to break free from old constraints. And in that sense, this deal is bigger than economics. It is about dignity, sovereignty, and the rewriting of Africa's destiny. Whether friend or critic, no one can deny that the world has been shaken by Burkina Faso's bold move, and the ripples of this decision will be felt for years to come.